Always makes me nervous. Here we go. So welcome everyone. This is, oh, that's simple. Oh, that's it. Simple strategies for supporting Aggies on the spectrum and all Aggies. This presentation is part of the Spectrum in Aggieland initiative. This is part of the outreach that we are doing, and we have several programs that we have already done that are on our website, and then we will continue to have programs planned in the spring. So some of those are already planned and will be advertised on our website. So feel free to join us for those programs coming up. We are partnering with several different individuals and offices as we do these programs. If you have an interest in autism or some area that you want to share with us, feel free to submit the interest form on our website, and we would be happy to hear from you. If you have ideas of things that we could do, would love to partner with you. But today we have Dr. Erinn Whiteside, who will be presenting. She has done this for us in person once, and it was very well received. And so we wanted to do it virtually so that our offsite locations could participate, as well as faculty members who it's a little bit easier to participate from your office. So Erinn is a clinical assistant professor of special education. She is also part of the Spectrum in Aggieland Advisory Board. She knows a lot about working with kids and young adults with autism and adults with autism, and also has been really open to learning, as we all have been learning through this process together. And so we're really excited to hear from her strategies. One of the things that she's going to repeat over and over again for you all and for us is that the things that she is talking about are going to be good strategies for all students. And so we think that's really important to recognize, is that this is not good teaching strategies just for students on the spectrum. Definitely they will benefit from this, but all students will benefit. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Erinn. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I think there may be times where she pauses, or at the end where we can also take questions. And Leslie Casares is also here. She's the coordinator of our Spectrum and Aggieland program, and she and I will be helping to moderate. So thanks, Erinn.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Let me get my screen set up. I didn't want to take control over too quickly. So as I'm getting it set up, if you are, I know we're on reading day. A lot of us just had our last day of class. So if you need something to pick you up this morning and this presentation's not enough, please feel free to try one of these. My personal favorite is Bubbles in the Angriest Voice You Can. So I encourage you to try that where you are. Even better if people are around you and don't know what you're doing. Get on my end. So if you do have questions, I'll have the chat box open. They'll be monitoring it as well. I've done a lot of online teaching and hybrid teaching, and so please just feel free to drop something in the chat box and I will see it. Okay, here we go. So as Christy mentioned, we are talking about simple steps to support autism in the classroom. And it really is all students. These strategies are helpful for all students. A lot of the things that I'll talk about, I'll share examples of when other students who don't have autism have asked me to use these strategies with them or found them helpful. One disclaimer that I do want to share is that I am not someone with autism. I'm not an autistic adult, and I think that's important. And so this is from my research and my work in the classroom and my interactions with autistic adults. And so I feel it's important to share that, that this not personal experiences, but just what I've learned through my work in my field. So we're going to have a quick hour and a half together. We're going to discuss briefly what autism is, because that's important to understand why you might be seeing some of the behaviors that you do. We'll talk about understanding accommodations. A lot of us get accommodations from the Disability Resources Office. So I want to explain why you might see some of those and how they directly relate to the characteristics of autism. And then we'll try to emphasize time for tips for your classroom that are helpful for all students, but specifically for individuals with autism. So I am a teacher at heart. I don't know if you heard clinical in the beginning of my title, but I can't do a presentation without some engagement. So if you don't mind dropping in the chat or turning on your mic and sharing, what do you think of when you hear the word autism? And this is a place where we're learning. You all came here to learn. And so if you're not confident in your answer, that's okay. Neurodiversity, socially awkward, someone who feels like they're different, savant behavior, yeah. Social struggles, misunderstood. I love that, Christy. Sensory overload. Differences in thinking and processing, yeah. It sounds like you all might have had some interactions before. A lot of these are what are often communicated in media and pop culture as well. So also before we dive in, I'd love to hear if you have any really specific questions that you came from, and if you're more comfortable sending them to me directly, you can do that as well. But I can use those to cater the examples and some of the discussions that we have throughout. And so if you have any specific questions, if you just came here to learn, that's okay too. But I just wanted to invite you, I'll keep going, but if you have some specific questions about autism, about supporting a student in your classroom, please go ahead and drop that in the chat and let me know, and I'll keep those in mind as we move forward. So we are in finals week, so we're going to start with some questions. Surprise. When's the last time you had a pop quiz? So what we're going to do is something called a waterfall activity. So I want you to type in the chat your answer, but don't hit enter. I'm going to give everyone a moment to respond, and then I'll say 1, 2, 3, go, and you'll all hit enter. So type in the chat, but don't hit enter. True or false? Most students with autism also have an intellectual disability. Think about it, type it in the chat. And go. Okay, we have a little bit of a mix here. This one is false. Yes. We'll talk about the specific stats in a few slides, but most students with autism do not have an intellectual disability. I believe the number is about 38% of students with autism have a comorbid intellectual disability, but having an intellectual disability is not part of the diagnosis of autism. Good. Next one, type it, but don't hit enter. True or false? Most students with autism received some kind of special education service in high school. So think about it, type it in the chat, don't hit enter. Few more seconds. And go. Got another mix. I love when I can stump some people. Yes, this is also false. Those with autism are not necessarily receiving special education services. And so something that we'll talk about is a lot of students with autism, particularly if they don't have that comorbid disability of intellectual disability, they very likely were not receiving any services in high school, right? And so they're learning how to advocate for themselves now that they've come to college and look at what kind of resources might support them in being successful. Okay, think about it, but don't hit enter. What is the current prevalence rate of autism in children as of the 2020 data from the CDC? We have 1 in 15, 1 in 36, 1 in 75, or 1 in 150. So think about it. Don't hit enter. Few more seconds. Okay, go. Y'all follow directions so well. Yes, the answer is B, 1 in 36. And so this data is collected. When they take this data, they look at major cities across the United States that are representative of the overall population, and they sample 8-year-olds, and they look at if they have a diagnosis of autism or a school eligibility of autism or concerns about autism. And so in 2020, that data showed that 1 in 36 children are considered to have autism. Oh, here we go. Okay. I think this is our last question. Multiple choice, think about it, type it, don't hit enter. Which of the following is the most acceptable language when discussing autism? So we have autistic, suffers from autism, high functioning, or all of the above. Think about it, don't hit enter. And go. Awesome. Yeah, I gave it away a little bit already, but the answer here is actually A, autistic. So that is the most acceptable language from these options. Has anyone heard that we are not supposed to refer to individuals with autism as autistic? So that was a common point of discussion several years ago, was that the argument was that we should not refer to these individuals as autistic because that we're communicating that that's all that they are and they're more than their autistic diagnosis. And so the conversation point several years ago was that we are referring to them as people with autism, right? Person first language. And that narrative has since been rewritten. Many autistic advocates have come out to say it is part of my identity. It can't be removed from my identity. If you were to remove my autistic traits, I would not be who I am. And so they self-identify as autistic. And so that has become more preferred in a lot of autistic communities. We'll talk about the others, but specifically, please don't say that people suffer from autism. It's not something, they're not suffering. It's part of who they are. It's their characteristics. It's not something that's cured, right? And then high functioning, we'll talk about this as well, but I challenge you, if you want to see what this feels like, I do this with a lot of students. Go up to someone and just look them in the eye and say, you are low functioning, and see how that feels, right? Not so great. I do that with students and they say, ooh, I don't like that. That's what we're communicating. There's a really wonderful video by an autistic advocate that says, when you call me high functioning, you think it's a compliment, but you're really just communicating to me that my autism doesn't affect you, but I promise you it affects me. And that really impacted me. And that's helped me to understand why we don't use the terms high functioning. So before we dive into the specifics of autism, I wanted to share this. If you're looking for a good resource to learn more about autism, I encourage you to use the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, ASAN. It's down there on the bottom. You can just Google that and it'll come up. But it's a group of autistic advocates who are on the board, who are working through and trying to share more information about the disability. And so this quote comes from them. And they say, there's no one way to be autistic. Some autistic people can speak, and some autistic people need to communicate in other ways. Some autistic people also have intellectual disabilities, and some autistic people don't. Some autistic people need a lot of help in their day-to-day lives, and some autistic people only need a little help. All of these people are autistic because there's no right or wrong way to be autistic. All of us experience autism differently, but we all contribute to the world in meaningful ways. We all deserve understanding and acceptance. So I just really love that quote. I wanted to use that as an opportunity to thank you for being here. By trying to learn about it, you're helping to promote that understanding and acceptance. And by modeling that in your own spaces, particularly your teaching spaces, that will help model for your other students how to interact and how to promote understanding and acceptance. So thank you for being here to learn. So finally, what you came for, introducing autism. We're going to talk about the truths of autism. We're going to talk about the characteristics, specifically how you may see those manifested in your classroom or in your respective spaces, and also dispelling a few myths. So the DSM, the Diagnostics Manual in Psychology used to diagnose disabilities, identifies these autistic characteristics. So first, Needs in social communication. So these are differences in social communication and social interaction across context. And that across context is really important. The specifics that they identify within that category are social emotional reciprocity, nonverbal communication behaviors, and relationships. So building those social skills, being able to understand, identify, and interact with particular emotions and what we consider socially acceptable ways, excuse me. And then nonverbal communications, being able to pick up on all of the different things that we say without saying it. And so I'll expand on those in a moment. You also see restricted or repetitive behaviors or interests. And this can look so many different ways for each individual with autism. And so you may see motor movements or speech that's repetitive, preferences for routines or predictability, highly restricted interests, and or sensory differences. And so all of the characteristics that we identify as being autistic characteristics that are part of the diagnostic criteria, you'll see under one of these two umbrellas. And they must demonstrate those across contexts for that diagnosis. Something that I did forget to say when I was talking about language is because there's a difference in self-advocates and how they prefer to be referenced, I will switch throughout my presentation between autistic and person with autism to respect the range of preferences that those individuals have. So social communication, what this might actually look like in your classroom. So we're going to talk about each of these, and I'm going to share some examples. I want to emphasize this does not mean every person with autism will display exactly these examples, right? And so autism is very, in my classroom, in the world of SPED, we often say, if you meet one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. They will all engage in some kind of difference in social communication and interaction, some kind of restricted or repetitive behavior or interest, but how those manifest vary wildly between each person. So you might see social emotional reciprocity needs in that area. That's in your classroom or in your space. You might see this manifested as difficulty or differences engaging with peers, reduced interest in course content, or not responding to emails or peers. This is part of some of that hidden social curriculum. So social interactions or social norms that we all understand, but are often not explicitly taught to us. Someone does not necessarily say to us, when you receive an email, you need to respond, or you need to let them know that you understand and received that content. And so this is something that might need to be explicitly explained to support the need of social or emotional reciprocity. Letting them know when I send you an email, please respond to let me know that you received that. An example of difficulty or differences engaging with peers. Individuals that experience this particular area of need may have trouble doing something that seems as simple to us as walking up to someone and providing a compliment, right? Walking up and saying, hey, I love your shirt. For whatever reason, there might be a large mental block there that might induce a lot of anxiety, not knowing exactly how to say it. A lot of autistic individuals recognize that they are different. They're just not always exactly sure how to correct, or it might be very difficult to engage in those different behaviors. And so that's some example of what this might look like. Nonverbal communicative behaviors. So this is where students might start talking to you as you try to start class, or you're packing up to leave, not looking at you as you talk or teach, or trouble understanding frustrations of peers. So this can also look a lot of different ways. I actually had a student in my class who was autistic and disclosed that with me. And this is one that I saw. I have a habit of being a slightly late running person. So I am that professor that runs into class just as class is about to start, and I'm setting my stuff down, and I usually have activities that I'm trying to organize, and I'm getting my computer up, and my general demeanor is very hurried, right? And this particular student would always come up to me at the beginning of class and start asking questions, and not yes or no questions like, hey, this is due on this date, right? They were very in-depth questions about assignments or content from class. When a lot of my students would understand with my hurried demeanor and the fact that I was so close to the time that class was starting, that might not be an appropriate time to come talk to me, that I didn't have the attention to provide at that time. This student did not understand that, and I wasn't able to focus. It caused me to start class late. And so eventually I just told her, hey, when you ask me a question at this point, I'm very busy and I can't focus and I can't give you the best answer. If you can wait until right after class, then I can probably give you a much better answer and be able to focus on your question. And she said, oh, okay. And never asked me another question at the beginning of class, right? And so she just needed that very direct, this is what my behavior means. And if you just do this instead, then that can be more helpful for both of us. And that helped her understand what those nonverbal behaviors meant. Another one, understanding frustration. Some students with autism may not pick up on some facial expressions or social behaviors that indicate that other students are frustrated, right? Or they might understand them, but they might not know exactly how to respond to them. So I know they're frustrated, but now I don't know what to do. And that is where having some explicit instructions on group work can help support those students. And then relationships, developing relationships with peers, adjusting between outside class behavior and in-class behavior. And I put those in quotes. So what I mean by this is some autistic students, they may engage in certain behaviors outside of class. So excessive phone use, although I will say that is not unique to autistic students. Talking more loudly during class, and having trouble transferring this to, I need to change my behavior in this setting. That's what that might look like here. They also might need some support or some structured guidance in developing relationships with peers. And so if you're working with students outside of a capacity of teaching, then it might be helpful to help create situations that can help foster some of those relationships. So that's just an example of how these might actually look, how they might manifest in your spaces. And then we have restricted or repetitive behaviors or interests. I think these are what I most commonly see kind of caricaturized in media depictions of individuals with autism. And what a lot of people think of when they think of students with more significant needs who are individuals with autism. And so here you might see movements or speech, repetitive behaviors in terms of movements or speech. So regularly fidgeting with items, smaller motor movements. I have a friend that was in the doctoral program with me, and every time she got excited, she knew she did it, but she couldn't stop. When she got excited, she would do this, just real quick, flutter the hands real quick. She couldn't help it. She'd get excited and she'd flutter her hands. And she knew it was different. She knew she couldn't stop. And at first she was embarrassed about it, but we told her, we love that. We love that you're excited and we love seeing that you're excited. And that's just your way of expressing it. You might have repetitive speech, saying the same thing over and over, saying the same thing at the same time within the class. So maybe they always say the same thing when they first start a question or they first walk into class. Some students with more significant needs may engage in what's called scripting. So they're repeating lines that they've heard in the past. In my classroom, when I was a teacher, one of our favorite things each morning was to try to figure out what movie did this student watch the night before, because he always came in quoting the movie and it was obscure lines. And so we tried to figure out what movie it was. And that is an example of those repetitive movements or scripting. Preference for routine, right? And so this is where students with autism may prefer routine or consistency, and where that might manifest in your classroom is struggling to adapt if that changes, or maybe not even struggling, but needing more of a heads up if it changes without a warning. Asking questions about changes or having rituals in class. So always sitting in the same seat, always needing to be the first one to answer a question. this is where if you do change something, so we're going to have class in this different setting today, or we're going to have class outside today, you might see a significant increase, more so than the other peers, in questions about those changes. What time do I need to be there? Where are we meeting? What do I need to have? What time do we need to be there? And trying to really make sure that they understand that change, because it might cause some anxiety or confusion for them. Having really specific interests. And so in your classroom, you might see this as continued discussion or revisiting specific topics when you or whoever they're having a conversation with have already moved away from that topic. There's a natural ebb and flow in conversations, but continuing to bring it back up. I know for me, when there's things I want to talk about, I might see in a conversation, I'm like, ooh, this is a great time to talk about this, right? And I find an opening, but individuals with autism might have trouble kind of waiting for those natural times and keep revisiting those specific discussion topics. And so if you're having trouble with students staying on top, or this might look like having trouble encouraging students to stay on topic in class when you're having conversations or group work. And then finally, sensory needs. And so this might look like needing breaks from class, either for sensory reasons or social reasons. Sensitivity to light, sound, or what I like to call chaos. Sometimes I think good learning means a little bit of chaos, having students up and moving around and doing group work and talking and discussing. That might be very overwhelming. That might be too much input. And so students might need to step away to take a break, right? Not knowing, that kind of feeds into the social communication, having trouble approaching or interacting outside of normal class interactions. So that might be overwhelming. The sound might be overwhelming. Needing to sit in a certain place, like, hey, if I sit in the corner, it's not because I'm trying to be on my computer, it's because that's where the light is the darkest and the overhead lights really bother me. That might see how you those are examples of how it might manifest in your classroom. Talking a little quickly, if you have any questions, please, I have the chat open, so please don't hesitate to drop that in if you do have any questions. And we're going to move on to some myths and inaccuracies. So the first one is around language. And I'll try to move through these fairly quickly so we can get to specific strategies in your class. But language is important, especially when you're talking about individuals with disabilities. I found this visual and I really like it. I really like how it depicts, and it actually provides a visual for all of these different terms that people might use to talk about autistic individuals. And so I mentioned briefly the person first versus identity first language. We are starting to shift. For a long time, there was a really big push of we're not using identity first. That's not all of who they are. And now it's really getting pushed back the other way. It is who I am. You can't separate me from that. And so using the term autistic instead of student with autism or person with autism. Again, I switch back and forth because I've heard different preferences from different people. I think the biggest thing is if you have someone express a preference, just go with that, right? And don't correct people, particularly people with autism. If they refer to themselves as autistic, don't say, no. You're more than that. You're a person with autism, right? That's not what we're doing in our classes. And then the other one, functioning labels. High functioning versus low functioning. This was something else that was very common up until recently. I just started hearing conversations about this about probably 2 years ago. In a lot of classrooms, you hear high functioning and low functioning still often communicated. And so really stopping to think about what we're saying with that, right? I gave the example of, I challenge you sometime today, look at somebody, look them right in the eyes and say, you are low functioning, right? And so maybe we're not saying that to people's faces when we use those terms, but we are saying it. That's what we're saying about people. And so moving away from that, I've shifted to the language of saying high support needs or students with more significant needs. Another reason this is important to consider is often you hear autism being talked about as being on a spectrum, right? And that is what these labels are meant to communicate. They're just not doing it well. They're saying if you're on one end of the spectrum, you're high functioning. If you're on the other end, you're low functioning. The reality is that it is not that that person is on a spectrum, it's that their specific characteristics are on a spectrum. And so you can't just slap that one label on there and say that's how their autism manifests. Some students might be on one end of the spectrum, or they might have less significant needs in terms of social communication, but they might have more significant needs or need more supports when it comes to perhaps special interests, right? And so you can't just use that to wholly describe one person. We have, I've heard people say there's so much more autism than there used to be. Disagree, respectfully disagree. It's not that there's more. We have just gotten much better at diagnosing it, right? All of those who we have formerly referred to as high functioning, those students where, as the one autistic advocate said, my autism doesn't affect you, we're starting to realize, oh, but it affects you, right? You're still needing some supports, or you might still be struggling through how to navigate some of these social landscapes. And so we've just gotten better at those diagnoses, and that's important to know. And so if you see the changes here in 2000, so 23 years ago, it was 1 in 150 students. 10 years later, 1 in 68. And then in 2020, 1 in 36. And so we're just getting better at identifying how those characteristics might manifest when they are not in need of very significant support. And so what I mean by that is the social communications and interactions. Before, probably the students that were more often were diagnosed were those who weren't speaking, right? That was a significant support. But those who maybe just really struggled internally with how to approach someone and ask a simple question, they were not being identified, and now they are. And I think part of what leads into that too is with social media and with this movement towards mental health, we're getting better at accepting when people express, this is hard for me, right? Or this is making me anxious, or I don't understand how to do that. And so that's allowing us to identify more individuals as well. Yes, Shannon, I agree that there may still be many more students who have not been diagnosed. You're right. Yeah, I would not be surprised if we see this number change again. I think eventually it'll slow down. I mean, we're not going to get to, 1 and 2, I don't think. But do think about, look around at the classes that you have. I usually have about 20 in my class because I have I teach just special ed students, so send us more. But across 2 cohorts, it's likely that I have one with autism. Yeah, so I think that will keep changing as we continue to get better and support those different needs. Thanks for asking that. And then awareness. This is something that I see needing to be supported a little more with a lot of instructors who are not familiar with autism. Not necessarily you all. I saw this a lot in general education when I was a teacher, and so I wouldn't be surprised if that manifests at the college level as well. But understanding that autism is not something that you can see. And so we just talked about the old labels of high and low functioning. Those students who are quiet and sit in a corner and don't say anything. And then you get a paper saying that they have autism or they require these supports, and why, right? You can't see autism, and a lot of students are very good at masking it. Has anyone heard of the term masking before? Drop in the chat if you've heard the term masking. Lots of us. And I'm sure some maybe who don't want to share that they haven't. And so masking, what that means is that individuals with autism, a lot of autistic students, they do recognize their differences in behavior, and they see how others interact and they copy it. I've watched a video where one autistic advocate said, I feel like an alien and I'm having to look around and see what everyone else is doing so I can copy it and fit in. And they do that all day. And it is exhausting. I've heard stories of so many autistic students that, particularly at the younger level, where they get picked up in their car at the end of the day, and as soon as they get in the car, they fall apart. They start crying. They'll go home and go to bed and sleep for 4 hours after school. And it's because it's exhausting throughout the entire day. They are constantly looking at, is my body language consistent with what everyone else's is? That thing that I just said to this person, did I do that the right way? Am I using the right words, right? And so constantly thinking through, am I doing what everyone else is doing? I had a friend in college who told me that he did these things. He said, I looked around in high school and I saw that everyone had a girlfriend, so I got one because that's what I was supposed to do. And then I looked around, and if I learned, if you have a girlfriend, you're supposed to hold her hand and you're supposed to hug her. And so I did that too. But he told me that it caused him physical pain, but that's what he was supposed to do. That's what he was supposed to do. And so he did it. And so I say that to say, you may not notice. You likely have many students with autism in your respective spaces that you would never know that they have autism because they're masking it. And so if you have a student that maybe suddenly snaps or start acting differently, if they act outside of their typical character, perhaps they were masking and they just got too tired, right? It just became too much that day. Or they seem to be interacting typically, right? That student couldn't have autism, they're masking, but that doesn't mean that it's not affecting them on the inside. Yes, Jennifer, if you don't mind holding on to that question, when I get to specific supports, I have some ways to support that. Jennifer asked, can you recommend a way to redirect a student with autism if they dominate discussion in class without making them feel hurt, angry, singled out? If you feel that question hasn't been answered when we get to that point, please ask it again, but I'll keep that in mind when we get there. The other thing that I wanted to share here, I mentioned earlier that I'd share it. As of 2023, only about 38% of students diagnosed with autism or receiving an eligibility in public schools under autism also have a comorbid intellectual disability diagnosis. And that specific language, that it's comorbid, is important. You notice intellectual functioning, IQ, was not part of the autistic diagnosis, right? And so having an intellectual disability is not part of autism. But about 38% of those that have been identified do also have that comorbid diagnosis. Those are the students who you might see having more significant disabilities, and that's because of how that's interacting with that intellectual disability. And then you have 38.6% actually have very high or above average IQ. And so your gifted students, right? Your students who might be dominating discussion because they understand it very well. They might be your students with autism as well. And so just important to know that it's not always obvious, and it might not always be who you think it is. And then knowing that autism, you might hear autism looks like this. I gave this example in my classes, but unfortunately I have reached the point where my students don't understand the reference. Rain Man, anyone think of Rain Man when you hear autism? Hopefully that reference still makes sense for this group. And so you might hear, oh, you're really good at what's your thing that you're good at, right? And that's often what is expressed with autism. Yes, good. I'm glad that I have not aged out of my peers. So autism looks very different for every person. You have those two diagnostic criteria, but they all manifest differently. I want to take this time to also note the way that they manifest across men and women is also very different. If you are interested, I'll share the video I keep referencing later, but it's a woman who is a self-advocate who talked about high and low functioning, and she does a really nice job of explaining that autism looks very differently in women, and that's why it takes them much longer to get diagnosed. Many women with autism, I think the average age is in the mid-teens, but I need to fact check that, but it's much later. Boys are often diagnosed early on, so in those developmental ages. And part of the reason is that the manifestation of those characteristics is very different. For a lot of girls with autism, that social and communication, that social interaction difference, remember, it's not always that you can't do it. Sometimes it's you don't know when to turn it off. And so a lot of individuals with autism, the way that might manifest is over talking, is not knowing when to stop a conversation, not knowing when to pause and let someone else start speaking, right? It might be too much eye contact. We often think of autism as not making eye contact. It might be too much, right? And I don't know when to stop looking at your eyes. And so understanding that it might look very different and not perpetuating this myth that it's kind of cookie cutter by saying, well, they can't have autism because they talk all the time, or they're always talking to their peers. That doesn't mean they don't have autism. I really, really like this visual over here. It's from Autism BC, and it shows, instead of a spectrum, it's really more this, I don't know what you would call this. It looks like a guitar pick to me. And it really just shows that there are different areas of need, right? And so someone might have more, they might need more support, or they might be more impacted by this sensory processing, but not information processing and not perseverative thinking. Or someone might have a lot of trouble. They might really struggle with perseverative thinking, which means thinking the same thing over and over again, really getting hooked on a particular topic and not being able to let it go. But they might not have more visible repetitive behaviors, and they might not struggle with executive functioning. And so knowing that it might look very different here. Shannon, that's a great question. I know that having autism, there are often comorbid diagnoses with those. I don't know the specific rate of ADHD, but I've heard anxiety, depression, ADHD, and OCD are common comorbid diagnoses. But now I will be going down a rabbit hole later today instead of grading and looking at what the data say about ADHD. Mm-hmm. No, you're okay. I'd rather do that anyway. And so again, this comes from that Autism Self-Advocacy Network. And so in their own words, talking about what autism looks like, they say we're thinking differently, we process our senses differently, we move differently, we communicate differently, we socialize differently, and we might need help with daily living skills. And so that is how they describe how their characteristics may manifest. Those diagnostic criteria may manifest for them. And then last but not least, if you don't take away anything else, please know that autism is not something that needs to be cured or fixed, right? It is not a disease. It is part of their personality. And a lot of times those characteristics can manifest in really cool and helpful and awesome ways. We talk about them as deficits, but they can actually be strengths for our student, especially if we can help them figure out how to use those strengths and how to help them really harness what they can allow them to do, right? And then giving them the supports in the areas that they need so they can interact with within their community the way that helps them be independent. So what time? Okay, we're doing good on time. How did we do this in an hour last time? And again, Shannon, and I think someone else asked the question, please keep asking questions if you have any. I'm briefly going to cover understanding accommodations. And so these are just a couple accommodations. There's a whole range that you might receive from disability resources, but these are just some examples that you might receive in that email that we get at the beginning of every semester. And I wanted to connect them specifically with some diagnostic criteria for autism to help you understand why that student might need them. Again, you might get this for a student that at face value, just looking at that student, you might say that student doesn't need that, or they hardly ever use that, right? But it's in times of stress where some of these characteristics might become less manageable, and they need to have them for those times. So you might see breaks as needed, right? I've heard people say, so they can just walk out of my class whenever they want. Yes, they can, right? Have a meeting with them beforehand if that's something that makes you nervous, to talk about what that might look like, how long they, you were thinking that they should step away. It shouldn't be a 20-minute break necessarily, but having that conversation here. And this is really, I've had students do this often in my class. They need a break. And if they don't have that break, then they're going to take all of their energy into focusing on not losing it, to put it in layman's terms, right? To not just have a meltdown, or to not totally shut down. It might not be visible, but they might not be learning anymore, right? And so they need to step away to let themselves kind of recharge in whatever that is that's overwhelming, whether it's the lights, it's the sound, it's the social interactions, and they just need to step away for a moment so they can manage their needs and then come back and be a contributing member of the classroom and also enhance their own learning. 2 diagnostic criteria for autism: that's needs in social communication and interactions, or differences there, and then restricted or repetitive behaviors or interests. Those are the 2. And I think we'll send out these slides after. Yes, yeah. Can you explain what you mean by disassociated skills?
Like some really strengths in certain areas, but not having the foundational skills that normally would predate those.
That's not, so to directly answer your question, that's not part of the diagnostic criteria. That might be a manifestation or a result of how their characteristics have manifested. And so maybe if they didn't get the supports that they needed to optimize their learning in a particular class or grade, then they might have missed out on some of those foundational skills. So that's an example of how the characteristics might manifest, but it's not a diagnostic criteria of autism. It could be, if that's something that you're seeing, it could be a result of a comorbid diagnosis interacting with autism. Okay, super. No problem. So another one that you might see: copies of notes or recording lecture. I know for me, I am someone who has an epiphany about what I'm going to teach 5 minutes before class, which is why I'm usually rushing in at the last minute, because I'm fixing my slides. And so sometimes I see this, and as a professor, I'm like, oh man, I'm going to have to be on top of it this semester. Epiphanies can only come the night before. But sending those notes ahead of time. So what this can do is help the students focus. Sometimes part of that sensitivity to sensory, having to read and listen and write, and trying to also maybe mask and manage all those social norms, it might be too overwhelming, and they're not actually getting the content, which is detrimental to them. And so by having something as simple as having a copy of the notes, so they can focus on listening while they're also managing whatever other characteristics they might have, can help support that student in actually accessing and understanding the material. Similarly, for recording the lecture, they can focus on writing and then go back and hear it again as needed, perhaps in an environment that's more conducive to their learning. And so if they are more sensitive to sound, and you're talking, but they're really hearing the scratch of the pencil behind them and the tap of this foot over here, and the lights are really bothering them, being able to go sit in perhaps a study room by themselves in Evans and being able to re-listen to that lecture can help them enhance their learning as well. Extended time or different location. Again, these individuals have differences in information processing, or they might, and they might have differences in sensory processing as well. And so having more time for that processing, or having a different location, it may be that being in a location where they are around other students, if you're all taking the test at the same time in the classroom, that might be too much sensory when they're having to focus so much on that one topic, on answering the questions for this high stakes exam, right? And so that's why you might see that as well. And then written steps is a common one. I had a student who had this accommodation, and so I just kept Post-its with me. And anytime I had a class activity, I wrote down the steps and I just very discreetly put it on her desk. So she was able to follow along. I found actually there were a couple lessons where I had the forethought, you know, the things you think of, and you're like, that was obvious, where I just put the steps in the slide and had it for everyone. And I found that those activities had a lot less questions. And so that's going to be one of the examples that I talk about, but that can help again with the information processing. That it might be, they might not be able to hold those instructions in their head. It might cause a lot of anxiety to ask for clarifications, or to ask for you to repeat the steps. And so it's just a very clear understanding of expectations during those activities. How do you balance an individual student needs versus the course structure? Larry, that's a really good question. I'm going to talk through the next one is tips for classrooms that help all students. And so honestly, what I find for a lot of students is that the supports that I integrate into my instruction to support that student's needs really help all students. And so that often alleviates some of having to balance that. If it's examples where I can't do that, then I just have to do a little bit of planning ahead that semester. And remembering that the documents that come along with these accommodations are pretty important, that we can't violate those. We can't just say, well, sorry, I forgot, or I didn't have time. A strategy that I found very helpful is setting an alarm in my phone to go out maybe the night before every day I have class. And that was just a prompt for me to remember, is there something I need to do for that student for my activities tomorrow? And I found that to be very helpful. Did that get close to answer your question maybe? Or
if I can ask out loud real quick, this was a colleague that this happened with earlier this semester. A student didn't have a specific accommodation, but approached the colleague and said, our recitation room is too loud and complicated. I can't focus, and therefore I cannot do any of the group work that is a required course component of the course, is the specific group work. And so I fully aware that named accommodations are federally protected,
yes.
And we find ways around that. But like in that situation, I want, like, it didn't happen to me, but I would want to do right by the student. But if it's clearly a, like, I can't do this, like the problem I have is interacting with the point of what this assignment is. There's not really an alternative assignment for group work when the point is group work and the student is saying, I can't do the group aspect of it. And that's kind of what I was curious about.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I didn't mean to throw any shade by talking about the legal requirements. I just, since it's being recorded, I felt necessary to make sure that I say that. In that specific example, I think what I would do is, Christy might not invite me back for any more talks, but I would email Christy or someone over at the Disability Resources Office and share, this is a scenario that I have. Do you have any recommendations? Some of the tips for the classroom that I'm getting ready to share might also help alleviate that. I think I might work with the student individually to kind of talk through what are some strategies for working in a group environment. A lot of times I found for all students, but especially for students with autism, explaining the why can be really helpful. And so if you can think of times, if that's more of a major specific class, like an engineering course, if you can say, you know, in a job in this field, here are specific examples of when you might have to do group work. So let's work together to think about how you could still contribute to group work even when it's overwhelming. Are there some things that you can do to help navigate that? I think it would be my first steps. And then some of the things that I'm getting ready to share in this last bit might be helpful too. But
yeah, Erinn, I would agree. And I think referring to our office is good, because a lot of times what we're going to want to do is we're not going to say, well, they shouldn't do the group work. We're going to look at what are the barriers and how do we remove those. So if it's in a classroom and everybody's going into groups, maybe their group can go in the hallway where there's less distraction, or depending on what the situation is, we're going to really try to look at how do we remove the barrier, but not have the student not do what the assigned work is. Yeah, and you don't have to bother just me. You can bother the person that works with your college specifically, but you're always welcome to borrow. I know Leslie, I knew it was Leslie's college there for Larry, but you're also always welcome to bother me too.
yes, and that's when in doubt. My first step is to probably reach out, even if it's just, this is happening, this is what I'm thinking, what are your thoughts, just to get a second perspective. And they've likely dealt with a similar scenario before across all different kinds of schools and colleges and major areas. And so they might be able to say, we actually had this happen in chemistry where they couldn't step out because they had to be at the lab table, and this is what they did. And so I would bother them for sure. It's not a bother. I'm being silly. Since we're talking about communication skills, I'm being silly. My experience and what my staff in our college always say too is, I rather you reach out and ask questions, let me help you, than help you clean up a mess afterwards. And so I would say ask for help if you need it. Okay, so we're finally, probably what most of you signed up for is tips for your classroom, things that actually help support all of your students. The first ones are visuals, steps, and examples. I find this really, really helpful for all of my students. Often when I have a visual up, I don't know if anyone started to experience this, but if you have a really, you have a good slide when all the students take a picture of it. I don't know if anyone else has experienced that too, but you see all the phones come up for a picture, which is always funny to me because I post my slides, but they take a picture. So having concrete instructions, examples, and written steps or instructions can be helpful for everyone. So what this does is clarify expectations. It can provide examples of what you're looking for and help support those differences in processing and memory. I promise this will help more students than just your autistic students, but really being able to reference back, wait, what were we supposed to do? Which questions are we answering? How many people are in a group? What page are we on? Having those listed. I also like to incorporate other visuals, like if you're using PowerPoint or Google Slides, embedding a video that's a timer so they see exactly how much time they have left. Having a visual model of what you're asking them to do. Visuals that complement the text on your slides can be really helpful. It decreases the cognitive load a little bit. And an example in these slides is that visual that I had about the different terms, and it showed the suffers from autism with autism as a knife, right? And why we shouldn't use that. And so including visual steps and examples in your instructions on your slides, on your handouts, whatever you might use, can be really helpful for all students. So these are some examples that I have from my classes, and any examples I share, I'm happy to share with you individually. I do an activity called Tweet It, where I have students practice summarizing an important article or a section of an article or a reading into just 280 characters. It's funny how much that stresses them out, but it's good practice. And so here are the instructions here. Read over your assigned section of the article. Their assigned section is on their slide so they can reference it. I have them linked. Assign a recorder, facilitator, and presenter, and exactly what those steps do. Summarize and or advertise your strategy in 280 characters. Get ready to share, take notes on others, and get creative. And clearly I set this up before Twitter became X. I think I'm going to keep it because I like the blue better than the black. But this is just an example of how the steps are very, very clear. So I would share a slideshow. They're each editing a slide, and this was the first slide in the slideshow. And it's funny because I use Google Slides, and you can always see where all the people, what slide they're on, and I would always see people jump back up to the slide and then go back to their own. So they're using those directions, and it minimizes how many questions I have to answer, and it also increased the quality of the products that they created. This was another one in an ethics class that I teach in my master's. Again, for each scenario, match the supervision related ethics code that best applies. Each scenario will match with one code, and each code should be used just once. So including those specific details here. Copy this into a new document before you start responding. Here's another example from one of my classes. I talk about scaffolding. So I teach special ed, and so I'm teaching scaffolding with scaffolding. And in this example, I'm talking to them about with task scaffolding, you're slowly shifting the responsibility of the steps of a new skill to the students. And then I include this visual here. So here are all the steps of the lesson. And so for lesson 1, the teacher's doing them all. In lesson 2, I cross it out. Student does that step, and then the teacher does the rest. So just a visual that complements what I discuss on this slide. And then one more, again, just a task analysis. My students are practicing writing a task analysis, which is breaking down a more complex skill into steps. And I have the steps here for them. I also, this is a series of slides. I want my students to locate articles. And so I have a series of slides where I show them exactly how to find articles through Texas A&M libraries. And I include the screenshots so they can see exactly what it should look like on their computers. And then I have them practice. And then I had lots of examples in here. I have a new project that the students complete. And so since it was new, I had a very bland version of exactly what I wanted them to do. And then said, repeat this process for all, but make it prettier. So just lots of examples of how you can provide visuals, examples, and support instruction that way. The next tip is having very clear grading criteria. And this also I find helps alleviate questions and enhances the quality of the product. It also teaches students self-management, and for students with autism who might have trouble understanding the way that you might present something, or you might explain something, or look for what you're looking for, where it might feel obvious to you, having that clear grading criteria can be something that they can go back and reference as a tool. So I have rubrics for all of my assignments, and I show them, or I tell them what they need to do for full credit for each section of the rubric, what partial credit might look like, and what no credit might look like. And then read through your instructions and rubrics, make sure nothing is implied or meant to be assumed. Clearly stating what to turn in. So I'll show on the next slide. I started adding that to all of my assignments, what the grading criteria will be. This will really help all students. And I tell my students, assign someone in your group or go through and grade yourself first. Look at the full credit column, find what you need to have for full credit, go point to that in your assignment so you know it's where I can find it. It can also help tie to real world functionality or application. And so explaining, this is how you will use this in your future job. This is how you will use this in the field. And that's why I'm looking for this piece in the assignment. So this is an example of what I've started adding to the top of every assignment. I've learned that sometimes I've encountered a catch-22 of very detailed assignments. I'm told they're very long and they didn't read all the instructions, but then shorter ones, they have questions. And so I've started including a quick, here's the big idea of this assignment. You need to read everything, but it provides some context for what they're getting ready to complete. And so for this, what do I submit? You submit a 3 to 4 page paper with a cover page and a references page in Canvas as a Word document or PDF. That alleviated so many links and pages and all different kinds. And then I magically was more likely to get the cover page and references page. What does it look like? The paper should follow all APA 7th edition formatting guidelines, double space, 1-inch margins, Times New Roman 12-point font. I've heard that as well. If I have students that approach me with that, then I account for something different. And but that's a good point, Francesca. And so I might update that to see what else APA 7th edition allows. That's a good question, William. So there's a question, with this level of specificity, how do you avoid training students to simply study for the test or teaching to the test versus critical thinking and the need for flexibility in the real world? I talk about that, right? And so what I'm looking for in many of my assignments does involve that critical thinking and that deeper thinking. And so that's part of my rubric, is you need to, make very clear connections that demonstrate that critical thinking. I talk about what that looks like in class. But I agree that, I understand your point, but I think, and it doesn't perhaps need to, in my field, this level of specificity is helpful. They're writing IEPs. They need to read IEPs that critically and that carefully. And so I am trying to promote that specific skill. I think that you could maybe find a happy medium if that's not the same for your field, but still looking at, is it very clear what you're looking for, right? And kind of laying that out is helpful for all students, and especially those with autism. Yeah. Here's just an example of, I do Flipgrid, which is a video recording app instead of discussion posts for many. And so I give them examples, and this is for a younger class of students. And so I show them, this is what I'm looking for in your discussion post, right? Particularly for students with autism, saying certain phrases may be less clear to them. And so if you just say, I need you to thoroughly describe, that might be a little vague. And so I give examples of what I'm looking for to make it very clear, as demonstrated in the Collins article, or the point made in the BuzzFeed video about individuals with visual impairments helped me do this. They reflect critical, deeper level of thinking. Here's an example of what that might look like. When partial credit is applied, I show an example of what that might look like. So all of the sources helped me realize, and I tell them what they did wrong and how they might correct it, right? And so again, to your point, William, I do this initially, but I start to fade that back. And so it's starting to teach them those skills and then learn how to apply them. But I find a lot of what often happens with my students is they're never taught, or maybe some are taught in high school, but others aren't. And I prefer to just take the stance of, I'm going to teach you. And it might be review for some, but it might be the first time others have heard how to do this. And then they're prepared for future classes. Yes. Another example, again, what should you submit? What should it look like? Here are the steps. So I just wanted to provide some examples. The next one, and I think this might get to some of the group work questions that we had, creating and reminding of class norms or expectations. Depending on your field or the size of your class, the way that you do this or how in depth you go with this can vary. But higher education on its own, but then also all of society has what we call a hidden curriculum. So that is expectations or social norms that often aren't explicitly explained or stated. And I am of the idea that we should help demystify that, right? That's how we help support all of our students, not just those with autism. So explain your expectations of how to interact with one another, social expectations for group projects, or how or when to ask for help. This can be done on syllabus day, then you can use it as a reminder. There are a variety of ways you can do this. You can develop norms and say, here are my 4 norms for this class. This is what I expect. This is how you should interact with others. When there's a conflict in the group work, you should do this. And teaching them how to work together, right? And how to resolve those conflicts. That's part of what they're learning here. And so providing a little bit of explicit instructions so they are more effective group members and society members as they move forward. I do I have smaller class sizes, and so I am fortunate enough that we create class norms together. The students write down what they believe is important to them as they move through that class, and they create, I would encourage 3 to 5 norms, don't do 10 or 20. And this also really helps me give feedback when there's an issue, right? If a student's not contributing, I say, we all agree together on these norms, right? And by doing X, you are not agreeing to this norm. Let's talk about what that might look like. And so it's something that they already agreed to. It's something you already explicitly stated, which I found makes it much easier to address problems in your classroom in the future. Yes, so helpful for first gen. If you have very large classes, but perhaps there's group projects, have that be the first part of the group project. Work together to create and agree to 3 to 4 group norms. You'll revisit these throughout the semester as you work on the group project. Here are some examples of how you can do that. So with communication, clarifying expectations on how to communicate with you. I've found more and more, a lot of students are not as well versed in appropriate email, right? So this is when you should email me. This is how you should address, if that's important to you. This is how you should address me in the email. You need to give me at least 48 hours to get back to you. If you email me on Friday afternoon, please don't expect an answer Monday morning. Saturday and Sunday don't count. You know, having a line in your syllabus. If you have GAs, if you have a question about blank, email me or the GA or whoever. Your group mates. Having explicit instructions around group work. Make a quick video, slide, or handout explaining your expectations for how they work together. And again, how that will impact them in the real world. So going back to my SPED world, I have a group project and I say, your whole life will be a group project. You're writing IEPs, individualized education plans together, right? That you have to learn how to do this. And then in-class interaction, so explicitly stating expectations or co-creating group norms for in-class discussions, asking questions, maybe having group norms of everyone's voice is heard. Okay, what does that look like? If everyone's voice is heard, that means that after we've spoken, we pause for others to speak. We make sure that others have a chance to vocalize their thoughts and their opinions before I start again. Right. And so clearly stating that. And then again, I think someone asked a question about that specifically, then if you have violations of those norms, then you can meet with that student and say, remember, in our class discussions, one of our norms is giving space for everyone's voices to be heard. If you're having to provide corrective feedback for any of these, I encourage you to tie it back to a norm or an expectation you've stated or created, but make sure you tell them what to do instead. Simply saying, don't do that is not helpful. The reason they're doing that is because they may not understand or they may have forgotten what they're supposed to do. And so say, if you have something that you really want to say, write it down and then cross it out as you get to say it again, right? But let's make sure that all of the voices are heard so that everyone has a chance to contribute. These are some examples of how I've explicitly taught these in my class. I have a series of slides and I teach it once. So everybody knows how to do it. Everyone knows how to email. So I say, if you're addressing faculty members as, it's as doctor, if you're unsure, use professor, or check out the directory page. That's the norm in my field. I know other schools and colleges might have different norms. Appropriate salutations, any of these. Not using abbreviations or emojis unless you know the person. And I said 24 hours, but I'm starting to shift to 48. But give at least this amount of time unless told otherwise. Don't count the weekends, right? You might even say, if you haven't, I have a lot of students ask me, I haven't heard from someone, what do I do? And I say, well, first, how long has it been? I emailed them yesterday. You need to give them some more time, right? It's been 2 weeks. Okay, let's send a follow-up email. This is what that might look like, right? And so giving them that support. I include collaboration as part of group projects. And so because I believe that if you're doing a group project, it is to help develop those skills that they will use later. And so we should be teaching that as well. And so thinking through, how are they doing that? And sometimes it's not always about completely equal division of work. Sometimes it's, I had something come up, but how did I communicate? And how did I follow back up when I wasn't able to do what I said I was going to do? And so I make that clear. This is what you're learning through collaboration. This is what I expect during this group project. And this is how you get those full points. This is an example of the norms in my class that semester. I also said, let's do professor norms. What would you like from me? And of course, I contributed to that and talked about what was acceptable, but I thought that a lot of these were very reasonable, right? And I loved theirs here, give today's 100%. And that what that looks like each day will be different, but give today's 100%. This is an example of some slides that I created. If you'd like to create community norms, I created some slides to help facilitate that process in your class, and it has notes for instructors. And so there are instructions for you in the speaker notes. This is what they look like. I'll just click through them quickly. They give examples of the community norms. It kind of breaks it down how they should. So first they think about things that they want, then they work with partner or a group to narrow those down, and then they share out all together, and then you have the ones that are most ranked. And you can't see my notes, but there's information on how to use these. So if you'd like these, I'm more than happy to share them with you. And I do find that they're helpful for all students. Someone said first gen, that it's really helpful for these students as well. Some students might say, yeah, I know, but it really can be helpful. And again, I love them because it's so helpful when I need to provide corrective feedback. This is our norm. This is our expectation. This is how your behavior in this instance didn't meet that. This is what you can change to meet the norm or expectation. And then I think we're getting close to the end of my my tips. Let's see, I think you said autism is underdiagnosed. Does A&M do anything to help undiagnosed students when they matriculate? If they aren't aware, they will never get the accommodation they need. That's a really good question. I will say, when I talk about autism in my class, probably every semester, I have 1 or 2 students that go, I really relate with what you just talked about today. That might be a better Christy question.
Yeah, the challenge is we don't know who those students are. So I would say that's part of why we're doing the Spectrum and Aggieland initiative, is that the things that we are having the experts talk about will be beneficial to all students. And so hopefully, you know, as people come to A&M and they get support that they need, that may be helpful. We do work with the Career Center for students registered with our office, but also doing some education and information providing for them. So if they're working with a student that we don't know about, or maybe hasn't been diagnosed, they can still be providing some of those tips. But if we don't know that a student has autism, you know, there's not really a way for us to be able to support them. And, you know, that's why, part of why we know there are students here on campus that are not connected with our office that do have autism. And, you know, hopefully they're getting support in a lot of different ways by all of the different good teaching that's happening.
And that's another reason that I really like to say that these strategies are helpful for all students. You may have undiagnosed students in your class. They might not recognize it, but that doesn't mean that they're not still trying to manage some of these characteristics and how they might present a challenge in some of these settings. And so by just saying, you know what, I don't have anyone with accommodations this semester, but I'm still going to do all of these strategies. It can help all your students. And as we've been saying, I've seen in the chat, this helps first gen. This might help non-traditional students, right? Who are have other variables that they're coming to class with. And so, yeah, I think it's important to just go ahead and do it. And also, if you have students that you notice might be struggling, I would not say, I think you have autism, you should go to the Disability Resources Center, but you can say, I've noticed that you're struggling with this. If you think that supports or accommodations might be helpful for you, this is what you can do, and send them to Disability Resources, and they can help them navigate that process and help provide them with those supports.
And I will share that, so we do, I mentioned earlier, we have an interest form on our Spectrum and Aggieland website, and Leslie has gotten some faculty members who have said they are autistic and they are interested in knowing more. And so this initiative that we have is very open-ended. I keep saying the sky's the limit. The budget is limited, but if there are things that come out of this where we get a lot of faculty members saying, hey, I have autism, or I think I do, or I could use some additional support, then we could work with HR, maybe with Living Well or some other entities to put those faculty members together or staff members together to form some support. Our office doesn't have the capacity to do that, but we are always happy to be the connecting point.
Yes, and I see Shannon beat me too. I was going to say all of the tips that I'm recommending, I think can also be helpful for administrators working with faculty and staff, right? So clear expectations and statement of social norms, maybe for the department. I think our department has created social norms or not social norms, but expectations that we've all agreed upon together. In your meetings, something like, I talk about visuals and structure, having an agenda, right? So you know exactly what that meeting looks like, stating the purpose of it. So I think that you can incorporate a lot of these into administrative work as well. So I'm glad that you brought that up. My last two tips, one, patience with a variety of social, I put quote unquote norms, right? And so we say that these are differences in how students or individuals might navigate the world. They have these social differences, but our number is also 1 in 36, right? And so I argue, what are norms anymore, right? If we have this many individuals who are operating outside of what we consider the norm, but just know that students are going to engage in a variety of social norms. And this isn't just autistic students. We have first gen students. We have students from other countries. We have students from other parts of our country who might not be engaging in the same norms as us. And so really, what is normal and appropriate to you might not be clear or the same to them. And my favorite example to help really illustrate this point is in public school. I've heard a teacher say before to a rowdy group of students, she said, I need you all to act like you're in church right now. And what she meant was be quiet and sit down and be still. That is not what church looks like for it. First, not everyone goes to church. And second, that's not what church looks like for everyone. For some people, church is loud and it's yelling and it's standing up. And so if a student were then to start shouting out answers or to stand when they got excited, they would get in trouble because the teacher thinks they're going against what she said, but to them, they're following her instructions. And so I use that example to say what we consider normal or appropriate might not be clear to everyone. And so stating those very clearly at the beginning of your class, this is what I expect. This is what engagement looks like to me. This is what I expect during your group work, can make some of navigating that a little easier. And so just having patience with those variety of social norms. If you have to correct something, letting them know why it's a problem. I gave the example of my student at the beginning of class. I said, it's not that I don't want you asking questions. I just can't focus right now. If you ask me a question at this point, of the class, I would be in a better place to respond. And so incorporating and having patience with those social norms is important. Or asking a student, why do you do this? How does this help you? Let's look at a different way that we might be able to reach the same goal. So specifically with autism, some normal interactions or differences in interactions that you might see. Again, this is not everyone, but some examples: eye contact, don't always expect that, right? I can tell you, my sister, who does not have autism, she has very severe ADHD, and she's told me, if I am looking at you, I am not listening to you. For me to best listen, I need to be moving or doing something. And so just knowing that eye contact does not necessarily mean disrespect or that they're not listening. Directness. Sometimes you might get really direct responses. What do you think of this? Can you do this? An example I give a lot is if you state a direction as a question, then an appropriate answer is no. If you say, can you start your worksheet for me? An appropriate answer is no, because you've asked them the question, right? And so that directness might sometimes be perceived as rude, but it's often not the intent. And so just clarify with expectations or a follow-up conversation. And understand that that might be what it is. It's not someone trying to challenge you. And so that's similar with questions, pushing back against ideas, and just considering how you're framing your instructions, right? But knowing that sometimes that very direct, I don't like this, I don't understand, this was not explained clearly, that directness could be a characteristic of autism and is not meant to be rude or disrespectful. And then check-ins and scaffolding of work, helping them develop those skills, particularly if you have classes with younger students, so that they can learn to build these as habits and become more successful as they get older and go out into their field. And so help students learn and practice good time management skills. I have examples in my class that I'll show you how I start to embed that so they can start to self-monitor as they go on. So in my syllabus here, there's a paper. And so for that first paper, not the second one, I give tips based on when we cover content. I say, okay, by now you should probably finish this part of the paper. By now you should probably finish this part of the paper. And so I show them how they can build on it, and rather than writing the whole paper the night before it's due, right? So this is how you can start to build and write that part of the paper after we've discussed that component in class. Here's another example in one of my projects. I say, across the weeks, you might want to start doing this so you can build parts of it and get feedback from me before it's due. And so just a couple examples of how I start to do that to help them build those skills, because then if they do it and they're successful, they're more likely to do that for the next project when you have not built in those scaffoldings. If you want some more resources and tips, these are some good autistic resources or resources for autism. Again, here's the autistic advocacy, ASAN, that I was talking about. We have some Texas specific ones. I really like this one. It's a firsthand experience of an autistic college student. I thought that perspective was important. And so again, we'll share these slides. And I am right at time, I think. So I really appreciated everyone's questions. I hope I answered them. I can stick around for a little bit if anyone has any specific questions, but I'm in Harrington Tower if anyone wants to come see me. It's near the Starbucks in Harrington or in Evans. And you can also email me with any questions or if you want some of these resources. But thank you so much. I hope it was helpful. I hope you got some real tangible supports that you can use in your class.